you are doing well. I hope that things are going well for you and your family. And I kind of wanted to jump in here and to start talking about ancient Kemet a little bit as I kind of close out some things and get started and jump into this. And I want to kind of take some time to talk a little bit about ancient Kemet. And so I hope that you are doing well, that you're having a blessed day today. And as I think about ancient Kemet and I think about some of the important things with respect to just the history behind it and so many things that have been done and said about it, I think it's important to have kind of some keys and some understanding when you think about it. A lot of times you think about ancient Kemet and the Old Kingdom, there's a lot of things that are there that are sometimes mixed up in terms of time and the timeline. So I've been working a lot on this timeline. I want to be sharing this with you. So I'm going to be talking about ancient Kemet and talking about the Old Kingdom in particular and some things about the Old Kingdom probably all week long. So if you get a chance to join me, please join me here. I'll be back here about 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time to talk to you about this. And I'll try to do a series of things all week around ancient Kemet and the Old Kingdom in particular. And I think it's so important to have a timeline, to have an understanding of what we're talking about so we can have some perspective around it. So I'll ask that you share this information. Please like it, subscribe to, share this with somebody. That's what I ask you more than anything. Share this with somebody. If you want to become a member, I'll have some resources that you can download. If you're a member, if you're a paid member here on YouTube, there'll be resources that you can download that you'll have access to. But let's talk about it. Let's jump into this and let's share this with somebody. And if you want resources, I'll be able to give it to you. So been working on this timeline. This timeline here kind of gives us an idea of some things with respect to ancient Kemet. And there are three things I want to cover. There's three things I really want to talk about. I want to talk about the expanse of ancient Kemet, and not just Kemet, but also Kush and the whole area of the Nile Valley and what took place, some things that took place prior to Kemet even becoming a country, even becoming a political unit, if you will, because it's really all about unifying the two lands, which made Kemet, right? But there's a whole culture and things that took place before that. I want to talk about, that's the first thing. Then I want to talk about a couple of important things that they had in terms of the writing system and calendar, different things like that gives us some idea of what was setting up this culture. So as we kind of jump into it, I want to kind of draw your attention to the outline and the timeline that you see here. And you can see a couple things here. And you'll notice that I have the time frame of 3100 BC. So that's around the time that many people believe that ancient Kemet became a political unit, if you will. It became a society, if you will. But I want you to notice that there are things before that. There are things that are happening before ancient Kemet is a country and is a unit. And that's very important because it's not like the people who were living in the Nile Valley just all of a sudden just stopped living in the Nile Valley and then something new just happened. We sometimes like to think about things in history as if there was a line drawn and something magical happened after that line. Well, it doesn't really happen like that. There's a continuity that takes place. It's kind of like when you get married and you think things are going to be so incredible and different after you get married or after you have a baby. You're the same people going into it, and it's going to be a continuation of what you are on the inside. The same thing with people and development in societies. It is not as if the people who lived in the Nile Valley were somehow completely different, incredibly different after the two lands joined together, and they weren't like that way beforehand. There was certainly a significant event. There were certain things that happened, but they were people long before it. And I want to kind of point to a couple of things to give us some perspective with respect to that. A lot of things that they've found, archaeologically speaking, they found a lot of resources and a lot of like artifacts. And you can look at this particular bowl up here. This bowl that I mentioned that right here has some Nubian patterns on it. And it dates back to like 3500 BC. It dates back to before Kemet was Kemet, before 3100 BC. So this bowl, this artifact here, is actually older than Kemet itself. It's actually older than Egypt, Kemet, as you like to call it. It's hundreds of years older than that. And one of the things that archaeologists have found is that there have been many, many instances of artifacts that have been found in ancient Kemet or even found in Kush that were from one land or the other. So you might find something in the lower part or the southern part of ancient Kemet, or the northern part, which is the lower part of ancient Kemet, that came from Nubia. That was distinctly Nubian. And as I mentioned to you, this bowl right here is about 3500 to 3300 BC. So it's well before Kemet becomes a country. And this is a Nubian type of pattern, a Nubian type of bowl. They've found so many artifacts that show that there is relationship going up and down the Nile Valley, that the Nile Valley is not some highway that's like, just off limits for people, or somehow people are not going up and down the Nile Valley as you think about it. I want to kind of share this map with you just so you can get some perspective with respect to that. in terms of what we're talking about. So as you see right here at the top part of the Nile Valley, you see Lower Kemet. So you see Lower Kemet, that is in the upper part, the northern part of ancient Kemet, and that's part of how the Nile Valley and the Nile River kind of flows from the highlands of Ethiopia and from places in Kenya, and it kind of goes from south to north. And so the Lower Kemet is the northern part. And if you go all the way down to the farther south, that's Upper Nubia. So that's the area we're going to be talking about. When we talk about Kush, we're going to be talking about Upper Nubia. And when we think about Upper Nubia, we're going to be thinking about it within the context of anything below the second cataract. So a cataract, if you don't know, you probably do, is a major rocky area of the Nile. So they have these areas in the Nile Valley that are huge rocky areas where, I mean, I'm not talking about a couple feet or a couple 100 feet. They may go on for miles, right? And they make it difficult for you to travel by boat. Now, keep in mind, people were traveling by boat before Kemet became a country, before Kemet, the two lands united, which we'll talk about in a minute. People were traveling by boats. We have evidence of that. We have pictures. We have drawings of that. People were going up and down now by boat as well, and by foot, and by, domestic animal, that type of thing, long before Kemet became a country, if you will, became a political entity. But as we think about the areas of ancient Kemet, we have Nubia, Upper Nubia. That has been traditionally what we call Kush. That's been traditionally the area of Kush. So we're going to think about that time from the second cataract all the way down to the sixth cataract. And as I mentioned, there are several very rocky areas in the Nile Valley. And if you take a look at that, it helps you kind of with the geography of it. So if you take a look right here, right where Aswan is, that's the first major rocky area of the Nile. Well, that serves as the southern boundary for ancient Kemet. So as we start talking about ancient Kemet, and we talk about the upper part of the southern part of Kemet and the lower part, which is the northern part of Kemet, those are the two lands, if you will. But the border of ancient Kemet stops really historically at the first cataract. That's where it stops. And then you go down from the first cataract to about the second cataract, and that's Lower Nubia. And there are all kinds of people. There are different kinds of people there. It's not just one person or one type of people. A lot of times when people talk about Nubia and they talk about places like that, they like to lump everybody together, which is just not right. We do that for Native Americans, for Native people all over the place. We would just say, lump a whole bunch of people who might have different traditions, different things that they think about, different relics that they look at, but they have similarities. They definitely have something in common, but it's not really fair to just lump them all together. They have their own distinctions and their own rights in of themselves. When you think about this Lower Nubia part, and you're thinking about that part that's there, that's one part of Nubia. So sometimes when you hear people talk about Nubia or Kush, they're conflating sometimes Lower Nubia and Upper Nubia, and they were distinct. So you have various people in the Lower Nubia part, right there where the southern border of ancient Kemet. There are a group of people, the Wawet, the Urjet, the Serchu, even the Medjay to the east. To the eastern desert, they were all there in the lower part of Nubia. And then when you get farther south, right, and you start getting into below the second cataract and you start getting into Upper Nubia, you start to get into the area that was traditionally either Yam, sometimes it's referred to as Yam, and sometimes it's referred to as Kush, right? Eventually it'll be referred to as Kush. And so we don't exactly know what they call themselves. This is what the ancient Kemetic people call them. So this area right around here where it's Kerma, it's Yam or it's Kush. So that area from the second cataract to the third cataract becomes a very significant area. The area of Kerma becomes a very significant area. Then as you start going into Napata, where the fourth cataract is, the fourth major rocky area of the Nile, that's also an important part. And then down to the fifth cataract, and then you get to Merowe, and then you get to the sixth cataract. So this whole area right here is Upper Nubia. So when we start to think about Kush, and we think about Nubia, there are distinctions to be made just because they were different people and they had different societies. And so, I don't like the term. I don't know if you are the same way. I don't like the term when people say, civilized this or civilizations. I mean, all people are people. All people are human beings. I mean, people are people. And so the idea that there are some people who are not civilized, unless you're killing people and doing crazy stuff, people are people. There's no the pre-civilization. That's just crazy stuff. These are societies. And as people form societies, which is what they were, in Upper Nubia and Lower Nubia, they had distinctions. So these civilizations, these societies had distinctions. And it's important as we think about that and we kind of dig into that to know that Upper Nubia is where Kush was located and Yam was located. And Lower Nubia was where a whole slew of people were located. And if you went farther south and to the east, you were going toward Punt, right? We know that Punt was south based on all the documentation and how people say they went. They literally documented how they went. went, and they documented how they got back. And they talked about how they brought back not just things from Punt, but they brought back things from Nubia, from places like the people like the Wawet as they were coming from Punt. So we know Punt was south, and we know it was to the east. And so you had a whole group of people in this whole area as they interacted with ancient Kemet. It wasn't just like it was just one or two people in Nubia and one or two people, and they were all the same. And they all had the exact same societies and the exact same rulers. So while they would have been maybe related, while they would have been connected with one another, they would have had different maybe kingships and societies and different rules and different, organizations that they set up in terms of how they did their society. So that's why it's very important to think about that and to look at that. So as we kind of go back to this and kind of look at this, it allows us to take a peek at a couple things. And so we know that the Nile Valley was a highway, right? So there was not just, one place here. It wasn't just like it was people were in the Nile Valley. We know they're in the Nile Valley for hundreds of thousands of years. People are Homo sapiens, Homo sapiens sapiens like you and I are in Africa and in the Nile Valley and in this area for hundreds of thousands of years. And it's not as if the people who developed traditions over that period of time just all left and then some people came back and it was just some miraculous thing that happened. They were there. And this is how all the societies that grew up, they grew up out of the people who were there, the people who were already there, the people who may have come back and migrated back. They grew up out of the people who were there, and it's not as if the people who were there for thousands of years just all left and somebody else totally created this new society and this new thing that we call Egypt now. So that wasn't the case. So as we think about it, another important thing to look at that as we think about just the Nile Valley and the corridor and the interactions that went on, as I mentioned here, they found so many different artifacts, so many different things that show that there was a relationship and trade going on up and down ancient Kemet and with Kush. So even before Kemet becomes a country, even before 3100 BC, even before the first and second dynasties, you find grave sites, you find artifacts, you even find the famous Custal incense burner. You can look it up. You can look at the University of Chicago. They have a whole write-up on it. They have it there. You can look it up. And they found not only artifacts, but they find various different symbols like the white crown of Upper Egypt found on artifacts that date before the start of ancient Kemet. So this is not like new news now. This is not like, breaking. We know this. People may not talk about it a lot. So you really can understand that this whole area that is the Nile Valley, that the people that are in Kush and that are in Kerma and that are eventually in Kemet, they are having all types of intercourse. They're having all types of trade and economics that you would typically have as a society, before Kemet becomes a country, before Kemet becomes Kemet as we know it. So that's very important for us to understand and helps us with perspective with that. The other thing I wanted to point out that I think is important, the Sahara Desert wasn't always a Sahara Desert. It wasn't always a desert. So if you go back about 9,000 years ago, so this is 8 to 7, this carbon dated years, but about 9,000 years ago, you will find that the Sahara Desert was a grassland. So we're talking a couple thousand years, a few thousand years before, obviously, Kemet becomes a country and Kush becomes a country. Kemet, this whole area, this part of Northeast Africa and parts of Northern Africa that is the Sahara Desert now, was a grassland. And it had to do with the impact of the glaciers and changes in climate. Obviously, it changed over thousands of years and it became a dry place again, a dry area, the Sahara Desert, one of the driest places on earth. But at the time when it was a grassland, you can imagine that people are all up and down here. People are all up and down the Nile Valley. People in what will become Kush, people in what will become Kemet, they're all up and down. They're up and down this area. And they are, trading. They are one of the most important things they have. You have the ability to do when you're living in a grassy area like the Sahara Desert was 9,000 years ago, is you can raise animals, right? Cattle becomes very important. So just like you see Hathor, the Egyptian, the Kemetic, the cow goddess, if you will, cow-like goddess, you see that cows are venerated up and down. If you study Nabta Playa, which is an archaeology area and an astronomy area in what is today Egypt, would have been Nubia at the time, Lower Nubia, you find grave sites, you find venerations of cows, you find the importance of the star Sirius. All of that's in place. All that's being done when the Sahara Desert is a grassland and changing over to desert as it's drying out. So people are going up and down there. People are going up and down the Nile Valley. They're doing it while it's a grassland. They're raising cattle and the desert starts to dry out. So you're talking 9,000 years ago, 5,000 years ago, 6,000 years ago, 7,000 years ago, things are drying out. And as things dry out, as you might imagine, what are people doing? people are going to go towards the water. So they're going to congregate toward where the Nile is. They're going to go towards the river because things are dry and you need water. You need to drink. So you could imagine that's important for animals. That's important for you to live. And then cattle become even more important. They become really important because they're like a walking kitchen. Almost a cow is almost like a walking grocery store because they make their own milk. So you can drink milk, they make their own milk and they have babies, and you can manage your cattle head and inventory and have, meat to eat. And so they become like very important to your survival in this area when you have a grassland and then you start into some things becoming desert. And then there's still some patches of grassy area where you can still raise cattle. That becomes a significant development in terms of why people start congregating around the Nile around 5,000 years ago, a little more than 5,000 years ago, even before that, 6,000 years ago, in very, very distinct societies that we talk about today. So we talk about them in terms of their characteristics as Kush and Nubia and places like Kemet, but we have to remember that they were already there ahead of time. And I wanted to kind of point out a couple of ancient cities in the lower part of Nubia, as well as in Egypt and in Upper Nubia, that might be important to you. So Kubania is something you might want to look up and think about. Sai Island, which is right up below the Second Cataract, and Kerma are areas that are historic areas. They're areas that are a part of Nubia and they're a part of distinct groups that would have been categorized as Nubians or Nubian predecessors or A group people who were categorized in a certain way in this time prior to Kemet becoming a country, if you will. And so this part right here, Kubania, is very interesting because that would have been one of the ancient groups, if you will, there just before Kemet became a country, and they would have been like Nubian ancestors, Nubian people, but they're right above that. They're right above that first cataract. So you start to see that this whole area that is Nubia slash Egypt, how we want to put it in our minds, it is not as like there was this major force field that stopped them from interacting with each other. It just wasn't the case. This was a situation where you had people who were up and down the Nile in a situation where the desert was growing fast. The Nile becomes an important source of river. And if you're located in a certain place where you can help products go up and down now, you can make a lot of money. You can kind of be rich. And that's kind of what happened. So as you start to think about it, I want to kind of point out an important city to you, and that's the city of Kerma. And if you take a look at this right here, Kerma is right around the third cataract of the Nile in what is called Upper Nubia in today's Sudan. And this was an ancient city that would have been around before Kemet was a country. Again, this was a strategic area, and it became a strategic area throughout the entire life and livelihood of ancient Kemet as well as Kush, because it was an area right there on the Nile, as I mentioned, where you had these rocky areas and you had trade going up and down. So just like you had things like they found this artifact, like this bowl that was, and they found many things, not just a bowl, many things to show that they were interacting in trade up and down the Nile, where, way farther south than Sudan, going up to the Mediterranean Sea and beyond, and across the Red Sea. These were people, these were Homo sapiens like you and I. They were doing stuff. They were not just in their small little cubby holes. They were interacting. Another thing that's interesting that I thought was interesting, and you find in the Metropolitan Museum of Art have this, and I'll show you some of the places where I get these images from. But this right here is actually a comb. And I want to kind of make this bigger so you can get a good look at it on the screen. This is a comb that is from Egypt, from a long time ago, about 3100, 3200 BC, and it's made out of ivory. And so you start to see that you have these products that come from much farther south than the Delta, right? I mean, it's not like you have a lot of elephants in the Delta, even 5,000 years ago, obviously, in what would have become Kemet. So they find these wonderful pieces of beautiful artwork of different types of resources that are there that are from other parts of the world, other parts. And I'm just looking at this is from around 3200 to 3100 BC, this particular, from the late Naqada period. And you can see, and I want to show where it's found from various parts of Egypt. You can find this. You can see this beautiful piece of ivory comb. And this comb, as I want to kind of blow it up for you so you can take a look at it. And you look at the very top of that, those are elephants. Those are elephants stomping on snakes, which is kind of interesting. So this is very intricately carved into this piece of ivory. There are elephants there. You see this wonderful type of bird. On the flip side, there's two sides to it. So this is just one side. On another side, you see giraffes. You see very distinct pictures and images of animals that are not that are not native to the desert, that are not native to the Delta. Giraffes and elephants and things of nature, and things like ivory. And so you start to see that there is this trade that's going on between Kemet and Kush up and down the Nile Valley for some period of time. It's going on there for some period of time, and it does not begin when Kemet becomes a country. That is a significant thing. So I'm not downplaying that was not a significant thing, but I don't think that we need to ignore the societies that existed before Kemet became a country, right? We gotta know that something was going on. It's not like it just popped out of nowhere. So as we look at that, we kind of take, what made Kemet a country? Like, what was it that made him a country? Because the actual dating, if you will, to when ancient Kemet became a country, if you will, is when it became a political entity, and that's around 3100 BC. So what's the event that they looked at and the event that we look at in respect to what they thought of their own people, as to made them a political entity for 3,000 years? What is that? And that was essentially the joining together of the two lands. So that's one of the things that they refer to their country as the two lands, or Kemet, as in the black land. That's one of the things they refer to their country as. They refer a lot to the two lands. You see that. And the two lands refer to Upper Egypt, which is the southern part of Kemet, Upper Egypt, or Lower Egypt, which is the northern part. Those are the two sections. And around 3100 BC or thereabouts, a little earlier than that, you had political societies developing. You had kingships, like you had rulers in place. You had people who were, governing over certain areas. You literally had small towns getting together and just forming coalitions. And when you form coalitions, a lot of times you have leaders in place, you have, political things start to develop, you start to have an economy, maybe you start to share agriculture, you start to share things and resources. And it's not like the people who were in Nubia somehow just left. There were definitely wars. There were definitely things that fought, but this was a blending. This was a people who were natively there who were developing their societies. And so you have Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt joined together as one. And it's said, and maybe I'll read it to you later on another one, because I was reading the pyramid text of Unas, and Unas is the last king of the 5th dynasty. And in his pyramid text, in his on the walls of his tomb, he talks about the joining of the lands for the first time. So he's in the 5th dynasty, and he talks about the white crown swallowing the cobra, the white crown taking over the cobra, and that's the white crown of Upper Egypt taking over the cobra, the symbol of Lower Egypt. And that's very interesting, because you see somebody coming from the south taking over, and obviously he's in the 5th dynasty, Unas, so he's not talking about the Middle Kingdom, because that hasn't happened yet. He's only talking about the one that first happened, so that hadn't happened yet. So you see someone coming from the southern part of Kemet and overtaking the lower part, and they become one land. And so when they join together and they become one political entity, that is when Kemet is born. That is ancient Kemet, when they join together and they become one political entity. That's what we're talking about. And for the better part of 3,000 years, they end up staying in that unity. They end up breaking apart sometimes. They have factions. They definitely have separations. They have wars that break out between them. They have infighting, but they maintain their culture for more than 3,000 years. Even when the Greeks come, they still maintain their culture. It isn't until the Romans, till much, much later, well over 3,000 years, that their temples and their culture stops being supported, if you will. So they're able to maintain an incredible culture for 3,000 years. That is the beginning of Kemet. And that's what we talk about. And that's what they talk about a lot in their literature and in their history. What makes Kemet Kemet? And so as we think about that, one important thing, the first important things to know is that they were people, and there was interaction up and down the Nile Valley before they became a country, before they decided that Lower Kemet and Upper Kemet would join. Before Upper Kemet came and took them over, before they decided that they would join, they were already having, as I mentioned, interaction up and down the Nile Valley. They were already trading with people in Kush. They were already had their religion in place. They already had many things in place. And that's why when you see this, it kind of becomes shocking, because a lot of people will study ancient Egypt, ancient Kemet, and they'll go, wow, they had writing so long ago. They had a calendar so long ago. Yeah. And if you look at Nabta Playa, if you look at that archaeological, that rock circle that's in the northern part in Nubia, right, and which would be in Lower Nubia, which you can find and you can look up, it's called Nabta Playa. You will find that they had astronomical things that they were doing 4,000 years before Christ, long before Kemet, because long before 3100 BC. There is evidence, absolute evidence, of the world's oldest archaeological astronomical observatory right there in that desert area that is now today the very most southern part of ancient Egypt. but it was at the time it was Lower Nubia. And so you have that well before Kemet, like over 1,000 years before the two lands joined. That archaeological observatory, that astronomical observatory is there in Nabta Playa. So they're already there. And so that becomes like a significant thing, because it's interesting to me, because not only do you find them, having a situation in place, but they end up having a number of things take place. They end up having, the calendar that they have in place was one of the things I want to talk about as well. Is, the second thing I wanted to mention is not only did they have trade and things going on before that, but they had a calendar in place. Their calendar was in place long before the Old Kingdom. So long before the Old Kingdom is in place, long before you're in this area, they have a calendar. And as I mentioned, in places like Nabta Playa, they had a astronomical observatory. So their calendar, one of the reasons why ancient Kemetic calendar is so important and is so historic is they were the first people, apparently, to give the world, if you will, a 365-day calendar. So if you can imagine, if you're looking right here and you see the stepped pyramid, one of the things that's important about the stepped pyramid is the pyramid of Dozier, is that it's aligned kind of on an axis where it's longer on the east and west than it is on the north and south. And it was kind of aligned so that King Dozier would be aligned with the stars that you can see in the sky from this part of Egypt that never set. So there are certain stars that when you look out in the horizon at nighttime, they don't set below the horizon. They were called like circumpolar stars, right? They kind of circumnavigate the pole, if you will. They circumpolar stars. And so ancient Kemetic kings were supposed to be like the stars that never set in the sky. So that's what they were. And so they, you imagine, we have a lot of light pollution. We, now modern day, we have a lot of light. We can't look up and see the sky filled with stars, thousands of stars in the sky, but they could. And so one of the brightest star in the sky is Sirius. And at this part of the world, this latitude in the world, the star Sirius, it can be seen for most of the time, a good part of the year, above the horizon. Like it doesn't set, you can always see it. But there's a period of time where it goes away. There's about 70 days when the star Sirius goes away. And when it comes back, it kind of rises in the eastern sky along with the sun. It's called the heliacal rising of Sirius. And you can see it come up in the eastern sky with the sun. And so when that happens, after it was gone, after it disappeared, if you will, for 70 days, that was a remarkable thing. And they not only, this is very important. The ancient Kemetic people not only recognize this, but the people who were in Nabta Playa 1,000 years before them also recognized this, because it was clear by the way they set up their astronomical observatory that they were also thinking about Sirius, the brightest star in the sky. It's the brightest star in the sky. And just so happens that when the brightest star in the sky, when Sirius would go away for a period of time where you couldn't see it at night, and then it came back, that coincided with the rising of the flood, the rising of the Nile, the flooding of the Nile. So when you start to think about that, and you had the flooding of the Nile, we talked about how significant that would be if you were in an area that was once grassland and now is drying out, and it's becoming drier and drier. It's becoming a desert, like the world's largest desert is becoming a desert. When the Nile would flood, that was significant, because that meant life. That meant your ability to have water. It meant your ability to travel, because it was much easier to travel up and down the Nile, because they did have boats. See, back then, obviously, it was much easier to travel up and down the Nile when it was flowing and it was overflowing and it was flooding, because you could get over the rocky areas much easier. And then also your cattle, your animals that you needed for your life could live because there's water, and you could plant food. So the flood of the Nile was so significant. So the fact that the Sirius star would be seen again in the nighttime sky or the dawn sky at around the same time as the Nile began to flood, and they began to bring life-giving waters and life-giving silt and soil back into that part of the Nile Valley, that was significant. And so that would happen, about 365 and a half and 1/4 days apart. And you found that the ancient Kemetic people, not that they were the first to notice the Sirius star, but they seem to be the first to document their calendar in 365 days. And so they end up having a situation where they have 12 months. They have 10 days in each week, 3 weeks for each month, so 30 days a month, and you end up having 360 days times 12, and then they added 5 extra days, and these 5 extra days were symbolic. They were able to coincide with that 5 extra days you needed for Sirius to come back up. but also they coincided with very significant deities. So Asar, Set, Nephthys, and Eru the elder, they coincided with them. So it was a remarkable thing. So they ended up having several different calendars. They had a lunar calendar where they looked at kind of like the cycles of the moon, and that helped them do religious feasts, and that helped them do ceremonial things that they would do that were very important to priests and so forth. But when it came to a civil calendar and for other things, they did have a 365-day calendar, and that was in place well before the Old Kingdom, which is a remarkable thing. And it's not surprising when you notice and understand that this was an entire area. There were people going on. There was a society before Kemet became a political entity. You wouldn't be surprised. Well, they had a calendar in place. You wouldn't be surprised. The other thing that they had in place was that they had hieroglyphics. They had writing. So writing, from a Kemetic standpoint, this writing is taking place, that the hieroglyphs that you see, and this is from Abu Simbel, from one of the temples at Abu Simbel, which is just beautiful here. But the hieroglyphics that you see are significant. The hieroglyphics, from a standpoint of just being able to read them, it's not the easiest thing. You got to kind of learn. It takes a while and to be able to read it and understand it. But they have symbols that represent ideas, as you might imagine. So a symbol might represent an idea, it might represent water, or it might represent a particular idea or a particular thing. But they're also has symbols that represented sound. So just like phonetics, like we have, A says ah is for A, and B is for B. They had phonetics and sounds for their hieroglyphics as well. So not only they represent ideas, they also represented sound. So you would be reading hieroglyphics and you might be sounding out a word, pronouncing a word, and you might also be knowing, oh, that's representing an idea, and it may sound like what the phonetic sound of that letter or that symbol is. So their hieroglyphic system was an entire system. And they also had other symbols that meant they gave you certain determinatives, or they gave you more information about a word. So you might be reading something and you might find a symbol that just tells you, hey, this is about feminine. This is in the feminine. We're talking about somebody who's feminine here, or we're talking about a woman here, or various information that may give you more information about what we're talking about. But their hieroglyphic system, their ability to write, was in place before they became a country. So as you start to think about it, I mean, those are the three things I really wanted to highlight. I wanted to point out is that ancient Kemet and Kush as well, ancient Kemet in general, there was trade, there were things going on before ancient Kemet became a country, before it became an entity. There was trade, there was interaction, there was commerce, there was economics going on up and down the Nile Valley. Not only did you have that, you had other traditions in place. There was a calendar in place long before the Old Kingdom. They already had a calendar in place, and they already had writing, right? They already had writing in place. So I just wanted to share those three things with you, and they kind of gave you some in-depth. So I thank you so much for listening. If you have questions or comments or things you want to hear about in the future as I talk about the Old Kingdom, please let me know. Drop some comments down below and I can get at them. We can talk about them. So God bless you. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope you have a great day.